The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and it's just you and me today. There's been lots of guests and lots of things happening this season, and some people have asked me a few times when is going to be the next just Anne only episode. I don't know if you can hear that, but Hepburn also here. So technically, I do have a guest, and I'm petting her head. Anyway, I wanted to say, because sometimes I forget, like any episode could be someone's first episode of this podcast. So if you're new, I mean, welcome. And just know that this show, we're all about vibes, historical vibes. I talk very conversationally. In fact, that's one of the meanings of the word vulgar, the vulgar tongue. It means like talking like the everyday people do. That's what this podcast is. I do a lot of research and then I put it into words that I understand so that you can hopefully understand the stories that I'm telling you, because history sometimes it can be overwhelming. It can be intimidating to me. I'm just talking about me. Where I'm just like, what is happening? Who is this? So even for me, like before I was doing this podcast, when I was reading stuff, I would just like, honestly, like just break it down to myself to be like, who is this? Who is this? Making up little names for people so you could tell them apart. And that's what we do on this podcast. So, I mean, just so you know what you're in for, that's the vibe. That's what's happening. And if that's not for you, I mean, God bless. And, you know, go read a textbook or whatever. Anyway, my name is Anne Foster. Did I say that? That's my name. Hepburn is my cat. And we're here doing an episode that's part of our extremely long, somewhat chaotic, but very fun Mary Queen of Scots season. There's something about Mary Queen of Scots. And so we're talking about Bess of Hardwick today, who is a person who has come up a few times, most notably towards the end of Mary's story when Bess's husband, who we call Mr. Bess, became sort of like the jailer of Mary Queen of Scots. But we said in that episode, like Bess of Hardwick, there's a lot to talk about. And I had written an essay about her a while ago, and I was like, oh, this is fine, easy peasy. Like I can just like look at that essay and just record me reading it, basically. Guess what? No, because there's so much I didn't include. It was a very short essay I wrote. So I read a very in-depth biography of Bess of Hardwick, and I'll tell you what the references are in a minute, a couple other things. So I wanted to give you a recommendation, which is a podcast that I just became aware of. In my defense, it just started, that I think is great. And it's called Dwarfism History. So it's a podcast hosted by Aubrey Smalls, who you might know from TikTok and Instagram at Aubrey Smalls. So this is a podcast about people with dwarfism throughout history, which is such an interesting and great topic. And I'm excited that someone like Aubrey, by which I mean someone who is cool and can break things down in a really understandable way, is doing this podcast because I think it's great. I'm really excited to learn every week from Aubrey. Here's how the show is described. Dwarfism can be traced back to the biblical days, yet stories of little people are rarely told. So in this new podcast series, Aubrey Smalls is changing that. Join us weekly as we uncover new and exciting stories of iconic people with dwarfism throughout history. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But honestly, I've been listening and you should all listen. Dwarfism History with Aubrey Smalls. So good. Very needed. Really interesting. And also just Aubrey, I've also just recently discovered him on Instagram. He does these hilarious videos. Anyway, one of my new favorite people, Aubrey Smalls. And today, one of my favorite people from history, Bess of Hardwick. And unlike everyone we've talked about in this season so far, I think she's not a royal person. She is non-royal. So there's definitely things that come up in her life that are similar to what we've seen other people go through, but it's also different because there's not, and she's the queen at the same time. So we know her as Bess of Hardwick. Technically, her name is Elizabeth Hardwick. She was one of 5 daughters in a family of minor gentry. She was born in and around 1527. Because she wasn't royal, we don't actually know when she was born exactly because there's a lot of kids being born in a lot of places. And if you're not royal back then, you just didn't record people's birth dates that much. And so for perspective, 1527, the year or around when she was born. This was about 6 years before Queen Elizabeth I was born. So the two of them, they have some dealings and they're like similar age, right? In terms of how I think of Tudor history sometimes, it's like, which wife was Henry VIII on at this point? And it's still Catherine of Aragon era, so pre-Anne Boleyn. In terms of other people we've talked about on this podcast, so this is about 10 years before the birth of Lady Jane Grey, who Bess also knew, and about 15 years before the birth of Mary, Queen of Scots. So just like right in the middle of what we think of as the Tudor era. So Bess and her family, trying to describe how wealthy or not she was is a challenge for me because I don't super understand the different types of levels of people in Tudor England. Because there can be people who they have this huge ancestral home and stuff, but they could actually themselves be very poor. Or there could be people who are able to work themselves up and have more money, but because they don't have a title, they're not considered upper class. So the trajectory of her life, like she ends up, I mean, you know what? Spoiler in a good way. She lives a much longer life than most people we talk about on this podcast, which is why this episode is going to maybe be kind of long. But she ended up a whole lot better off than she was before. She really set her family up for success. So she was born into what I'm going to consider for myself, even though this wasn't exactly the term then, just sort of like a middle class family. Like they had some connections to some royals, but kind of everyone did, and no one had any titles. And they were born in, so their ancestral land, Hardwick, is a place. They lived in a modest manor. So again, you're like, manor, you're like, so they were like rich and fancy. It's like, they're not really. And when you have that many children, you have to have money to feed them all. And then if they're daughters, she's one of 5 daughters, like you have to pay the money when they get married. Anyway, so I don't want to be like, oh, they were poor and, whatever, begging on the streets. No, but they were like not super well off, right? So their ancestral land, Hardwick, is in the county of Derbyshire, potentially pronounced Derbyshire. I mean, correct me, British members of the Tits Out Brigade, which new listeners is what we call listeners of this show. So her father died when she was very young, leaving a very small dowry to be split between Bess and her sisters. Her brother was set to inherit the Hardwick lands. So basically what they needed to do was to make themselves seem as appealing matches as possible for prospective husbands. And so with that in mind, to try and just make connections with important people and just make these girls seem like great catches. Bess was sent when she was around 12 years old to serve in the household of their distant relation, Lady Zouche, which is a great name, Zouche, or as Americans might say, Zouche. That felt very strange for me to say. To new listeners, I am Canadian. Anyway, so Lady Zouche was at Codnor Castle, which was nearby. And so this was a thing that happened a lot to people in kind of her status. Like this sort of appointment, the purpose of it was, it's almost like an internship. It was to allow young people from less notable families the opportunity to meet influential people in order to improve their stations. And so if you have a relative, even if it's like a really distant relative, you're like, can I send my daughter to your house just to like help out there, please? And like, I don't know, read your books and whatever. So remember, Bess was born pre-Anne Boleyn, the wives of Henry VIII. It's like Catherine of Aragon for a long time, Anne Boleyn for a short time, Jane Seymour for an even shorter time. Anyway, so at this point, he was on his third wife, Queen Jane Seymour. Lady Zouche was currently in service, so she was a lady in waiting to Jane Seymour at the time that Bess came into service for her. So this probably meant that Bess, as part of that household, would travel with Lady Zouche to and from the royal court of Henry VIII, which would give her sort of like open her eyes. Like she grew up in this kind of small community, just kind of seeing the wider world, but also just kind of how fucked up things were. While in service to Lady Zouche, Bess met a teen aristocrat named Robert Barley. And these two got married in 1543 when she was about 16 years old, and Robert Barley died like a year later. So just to contextualize this, there's a misconception that I myself fall victim to sometimes. I have to remind myself, like, wait, that's not actually what happened. That people in this era, or in many past eras and countries, would get married when they were young teenagers, especially young girls. Not true. It was kind of weird when that happened, and it was unexpected when that happened. The average age for women marrying in this time was, I think, something like 25 or something like that, like older than we assume, based on, I don't know, Romeo and Juliet or whatever. Or I think about people in this era getting married when they're really young, because you hear about that with like the people who are most written about, which are like royals. And those marriage negotiations happen when they're children, sometimes toddlers, because their parents, the kings and queens, really need to sort of cement these alliances. And so people are married when they're really, really young. To normal people like Bess, this would be weird that two 16-year-olds got married to each other. And so what this is probably about is that Robert Barley's dad was ill and seemed to be dying. And Robert Barley would inherit everything when the father, and this is going to come up later in the story, so I'll try to explain it as best as I understand it at the moment, which is that when the father of a household in this place and time died, and the heir, like their oldest son, was not old enough to inherit, which I'm not sure if that means 18 or 21, then that child would become a ward. There's like a wardship council, and different families could almost like buy these children and stuff. So just to sort of protect the family's interests, it was in their best interest for the son, Robert Barley, to get married, because that just changed the family connections and it would change the wardship situation, because it seemed like his dad was going to die. So his dad did die, but then also Robert Barley died. And I just remembered, I forgot to say my sources. The biography that I read to make my notes is called Devices and Desires, Bess of Hardwick and the Building of Elizabeth, England by Kate Hubbard. This book has got all the detail, especially if you're interested in architecture, because we're going to get into a lot of house building talk, some HGTV Tudor era talk. I also got information from Hardwick Hall's website at the nationaltrust.org.uk, and also a news article from the BBC, but I'll get to that at the end. But as we've had several times this season already, could not be more late breaking news. Like, I'm recording this in August 2023. There was news about Bess of Hardwick. So she's a teen, she was married, her husband died. She was a 16-year-old widow who had been married for a year. And so as the widow, and why was she chosen is an interesting question, and no one really knows. But maybe like they wanted to marry this guy, Robert Barley, because his father was going to die and for all these inheritance reasons. And maybe Bess just kind of seemed, she was there. I don't know how much at this point she's making herself stand out, or she did stand out, but for family reasons. And she should have been entitled to a portion of his family's estate as the widow of this son, but the Barley family refused to provide it to her. So guess what she did? And this is just setting up her whole personality for you, because we haven't really delved into that yet. So she's 17 years old, and she took them to court. She pursued the matter in a series of court battles and finally was awarded around £30 a year. So she had this marriage, he died, she's 17 years old, and she's just, they're like, oh, I'm sorry, teenager, we're going to not give you the money. And she's like, fuck that, give me my money. Because she deserved it, because she should have got it. She wasn't going for money that she wasn't owed. And she won. And this is a theme we're going to see a lot in her life, because she'd not take things sitting down. Is that the saying? If someone tried to take advantage of her, she would take them to court, and generally she would win. So she's still not wealthy, but already like this 30 pounds a year, she was much better off than she had been as a child. So with this money and with her experience now, like with Lady Zouche and, the books she read and the etiquette she was taught, she decided, she figured out, I'm going to move up in this world, bitches, look out. In 1545, she was placed in a position in the household of Lady Frances Grey, the Marchioness of Dorset at Bradgate House. So Lady Frances Grey is someone we have talked about before. I did a whole season about Lady Jane Grey, and this is her mom. So Frances Grey was the daughter of Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor. She was the mother of 3 daughters, so Lady Catherine Grey, Lady Mary Grey, and Lady Jane Grey. Bess is 10 years older than Lady Jane Grey. So if Bess is 20, Jane is 10, and Catherine and Mary Grey are quite a bit younger. But Bess of Hardwick is cool with people of all ages. She became friends with Jane Grey. She became friends also with Jane's mom, Lady Frances Grey. So Bess was just kind of like a cool older sister to the Grey girls and maybe like a cool younger sister to Lady Frances Grey. So they're all just pals, they're friends. And so the reason that she wound up there is, again, because the Grey family, if you look in the family tree, they're vaguely related somehow to Bess of Hardwick. So she was sent there again just as sort of a distant relative. And so she hung out there and she remained close to the Grey family throughout the next tumultuous era. So they clearly hit it off in a genuine way. So the Grey family was into what is described as, quote, new learning, which is the Reformation Protestant vibes, AKA what we call in the show the Renaissance Reformation Girl Squad, which is just cool people who are into being Protestant. This is what's happening in the household. Bess of Hardwick, nothing I read about her made me think that religion was as important to her as it was to, for instance, Jane Grey or to Mary Queen of Scots. But she was just I get it. That's what's happening and I'm cool with it. Because she was there with the Grey sisters, the Grey sisters we know all got a really humanist, I think it's called, education. And Bess was around that, but kind of none of this really rubbed off on her because that's not her deal. She's not into, reading the classics or whatever. We're going to see what her deal is, but it's not that. But she did have very, very neat italic, it's called, handwriting, Bess. And so she might have perfected that handwriting there with them because we know that Lady Jane Grey also had similarly very neat handwriting. And it was while she was around this household, because that's what she's about, is finding a wealthy husband to move up in this world. She first met William Cavendish, who would, spoiler, become husband number 2. So Bess is a young widow from Derbyshire or Derbyshire. She had no fortune or prospects, as Jane Austen might write. Even though she had this money from her first marriage, she was still just kind of who is she? I don't know her. And this guy, William Cavendish, who we're going to call WC, was a rising man at court, based out of London, and he was a real catch for her. So he was treasurer of the King's Chamber, which was a highly influential role in Henry VIII's court. He had been widowed twice before, which the number of people in the story who have had numerous marriages, it's not weird to them to have been married numerous times and people die all the time. And that's because there was a lot of plagues of smallpox, the sweating sickness. There's various reasons people died. But also if you're marrying when you're 16, maybe you'll have numerous spouses. So anyway, he'd been widowed twice before, but I don't want you to think he's a weird guy or whatever. It's just that's kind of everyone was. He had 2 daughters already who were about Bess's age, which is where I mentioned Bess is 20 and WC is about 42. So they were married at Bradgate, which is the house where she was staying, Frances Grey's house. And because of his rank, Bess now became Lady Cavendish. And he was so wealthy that she was now able to entirely change her lifestyle. It's interesting that this is who he chose to marry, right? Part of it is probably oh, she's young, she's 20. He has these older children, but he knows he could have more children with her because she's presumably just at the beginning of her fertile era of life. But also lots of people he met would have been. So something about Bess made her stand out, even though she was, she had no fortune, she had no prospects. And last week, I believe, the order that these episodes come out, I had the interview with Yenta Huang about his book, about Anna May Wong. And it just reminds me in that sense of somebody who comes from non-impressive background, like somebody who doesn't have connections or whatever, like the opposite of a Nepo baby, who just is so charismatic and interesting and engaging that everyone around them just notices, and then they get opportunities, or they make themselves opportunities. They find the opportunities, and then they have this sort of charisma to follow through on them. And we're going to see that in Bess's life as well, because there are some portraits of her that you can see if you just like do an image search for Bess of Hardwick portraits. And we see she looks, I would say, not fully comprehending the understanding of beauty in Tudor England. To me, she looks similar to Queen Elizabeth or to Mary Queen of Scots or to anyone, but she's never written about as being like a beautiful, gorgeous person. And it's funny because Mary Queen of Scots, for instance, was always written about as being this beautiful, captivating, engaging person. And I'm sure she was. But also she was the queen, so you kind of had to say that. But Bess of Hardwick, I've read in a couple different sources. I'm not sure. I don't want to like put the author of this book on blast, but I think it might have been in this book. Like, she was not beautiful. When you look at her portraits, like, that's not the expectation of what a beautiful woman would have looked like back then. So it's like interesting that she snagged this guy when she wasn't like the young, hot person in the room. But I would say, first of all, a portrait is subjective. Second of all, like, if you have a really interesting personality, sense of humor, intelligent, smart, like that often can supersede what you look like in a still photograph, right? And there's clearly something about Bess that made her so engaging and interesting that not just this guy, not just WC, but like so many people around her were just fond of her and enjoyed her. And some of the writing about her is like, it was so interesting because she wasn't even beautiful. And like, beautiful people are not necessarily interesting or charismatic. She was interesting, she was charismatic, and that made her hot. So she's married to WC. And so this, fortuitously for her, was 1547. This is a few years after Henry VIII had dissolved the monasteries as part of the Protestant Reformation. Not to get into that, but so that Henry VIII could marry Anne Boleyn, he decided to make the country be not Catholic anymore, but instead to start the Anglican religion, the Church of England, which was Protestant. And as he did that, that was a way that he could also take all the Catholic monasteries and just like be like, sorry, no more Catholic monasteries. No, this is like a house and I'm going to sell it to my friend or whatever. What this meant is that all of the highly valuable land previously owned by religious orders can now be taken over by rich people in search of land. And WC and Bess, because now they're married, they're a combo, they're a power couple, they were powerful enough that they got first pick of which property they wanted. And so of all the property that they could have taken, what they ended up taking was property in Derbyshire/Derbyshire, which is near where Bess grew up. So you have to presume that was her suggestion. She liked it there, is maybe part of it. She wanted to go back to a place she was familiar with. And or also she just wanted to go back there and like show off to everybody how she had improved herself so much. And so they started construction of a home that's still around today that you can visit. That's called Chatsworth House. And that was Bess's favorite. She has numerous homes we're going to talk about during this whole story, during her life. But that's where she would always return to when she's like in crisis, or when it's just kind of like, or when she's not in crisis, when everything's kind of like sorted out. She's like, I'm going to go back here. Like, this really was her home. That area where she was from was very close to her and very important to her. And also she liked the house they built. So you know what their relationship was like. They really liked each other. Later on, this is like, I'll tell you this fact now instead of what happens chronologically, because by then you might have forgotten who WC even is. But years and years and years and years, decades later, so Bess was spending some time hanging out with Mary Queen of Scots, doing embroidery, and together they made a hanging that is now known as the Cavendish hanging. And so we know from the various episodes we've done this season about embroidery and symbolism. So the Cavendish hanging shows tears falling onto smoking quicklime, and in Latin translated it says, tears witness that the quenched flame lives. In the border around this hanging are the initials of Bess and WC, the Cavendish arms, which is his last name, and assorted emblems of love, a cracked mirror, 3 broken rings, and a glove. Bear in mind, at the time she was making this, like, WC was dead. She was married to someone else. So like, clearly the relationship stuck with her and was important to her. This is a lot of the sources we have about her is there's a lot of letters that she wrote to from various people. And the ones from WC to her are all like, oh, my love, I adore you so much. You're perfection itself. And hers are like, you need to negotiate a better price from the guy doing the window finishings. And that's her love language, What they had in common, they were consumers. They really liked stuff. They really liked beautiful aesthetic things, including architecture and house and like door trimmings and like window panes. They also like getting new things and shopping and acquiring things. And they both like gambling. Like they were really rich and they were living their rich life and they both enjoyed it, So WC went to London all the time because of his job for Henry VIII. And so Bess was, again, she got to hang out more at royal court, but now from a higher up position than when she was there before. And this helped her shape her aesthetic tastes, like just being exposed to more fancy homes and different furnishings and different things like that. She got into studying classical texts. I said before she didn't do that, but in fact, she did do that. I guess what I was thinking, like she was scholarly, but in a really sort of aesthetic way. Like she wasn't sitting around like the Grey family. I picture they just sit around, or Jane Grey, just like reading the Bible, like really thinking heavily about like spiritual things. And Bess was more like, I like a well-rounded humanist education. She also liked architectural books, seeing, like what the buildings look like in ancient Greece and whatever. And so clearly she absorbed images from all the things she was reading and experiencing that would later inform the design of her houses, both outside and the interiors. And it was probably in this era that she might have first heard the stories of women from antiquity, like Cleopatra, which is going to come up later, believe it or not. So she and WC started having kids right away. This is why I suspect one of the reasons, besides her just being like the coolest person in the room always, was that she was young and he wanted to have more children. So their first child was a daughter named Frances, I believe named after Frances Grey, who was also one of her godparents. One of baby Frances's other godmothers was Catherine Willoughby, who we did an episode about in the Jane Grey season. She's also a member of the Renaissance Reformation Girl Squad. Bess just started basically having a baby every year for the next 8 years. That is what she was up to. But just the godparents that they chose for the various children were a very clear statement. Naming a godparent wasn't just like, oh, these are my friends or whatever. It's just, especially when you have this sort of role and this sort of status, it's like really showing who your allies are at royal court. So this was really showing that WC and Bess were fully aligned with the Grey family and therefore with Protestantism, which was the religion of England at the time. Their second daughter was named Temperance, which is interesting because they both like to gamble and live extravagantly. Jane Grey was one of Temperance's godmothers. One of Temperance's godfathers was the Earl of Shrewsbury, who is the father of Mr. Bess, who we will meet later on. Temperance sadly died within the year, but, more babies just keep coming. Next came their first son, Henry, who would grow up to be, Bess once described him as my bad son, Henry. He sucked. His godmother was Princess Elizabeth, like later Queen Elizabeth I. So like anyone could say like, oh, Queen Elizabeth is the godmother of my child. But this is like, they actually knew her. So interestingly, like at around this time or like after this is when, so King Henry VIII died. And then his teenage son, Edward, was king for like a couple years. And then he died. And then Lady Jane Grey was the queen famously for 9 days. And then she was pulled off the throne. And then Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, took over. And I did literally a season about Lady Jane Grey. Not time to retell that all right now. But all that happened. Mary I became queen. She was like, I'm going to make England Catholic again. And this is the time at which Bess had her third son, Charles. And godmother to Charles was, in fact, Queen Mary. And the godfather, Jane Grey's dad. This seems interesting because how fraught it was between Protestants and Catholics. But this is really just showing Bess being just so good at playing both sides of things and always being the good books of whoever was in control. Queen Mary had always been close to Frances Grey, who was her cousin, so they're probably just all part of that girl squad. And just timing-wise, Charles's christening was held 2 weeks after Jane Grey was tried and found guilty of treason. And baby Charles's godfather was Jane Grey's dad. Like, unbelievable time going on here. So Bess, Remember, she's 10 years older than Jane Grey, but they had met each other when Jane was like 8 and Bess was 18, and they hung out together and they practiced handwriting together. Jane had been godmother to Temperance, so they were close to each other. And what I found really touching and interesting, because we don't know a lot of Bess's inner life, and whose inner life does anyone know? But we do know that Bess kept a portrait of Jane in her bedchamber at Chatsworth for the rest of her life, for the rest of Bess's life. So clearly that affected her, what happened with Jane. So then she had a daughter whose name was Elizabeth. And you might remember Bess of Hardwick's real name is Elizabeth. So this is a naming daughter after self moment for those of you playing on the Vulgar History bingo card at home. Godmother to Elizabeth was Catherine Grey, Jane Grey's younger sister. Even though by now the Grey family was thoroughly disgraced because Jane's dad had joined this rebellion. But so it's interesting, like the loyalty that Bess shows to the Grey family, despite what their status was. She was a true friend to them. She didn't abandon them when all this drama happened. 1557. So she's 30 years old, mother of 6 surviving children. So WC fell ill and Bess rushed to be with him in London. He was there and she'd been one of the other properties, probably like with their like Von Trapp brood of children. He died. So Bess was a widow again, but now she also was, guess what, responsible for the considerable debt he had left because apparently they couldn't quite afford the extravagant lifestyle that they had been enjoying. She could have settled these debts by selling off some of their estates, but she did not want to do that. She knew she had to find a new husband. So by now on the throne is Elizabeth, who is the godmother of one of her children. Everything's Protestant again. England is Protestant again. Catholics still very much there. Anyway, she knew she had to find a new husband, someone even richer than WC to help pay off these debts and to help her ascent. Like she had gotten used to this like rich life and she wanted to keep going. So I don't know. I imagine her looking around the court, just being like, who's here? Who do I choose? Anyway, her best option, the person she chose and when she chooses a person, like that person chooses her back, like because she's Bess of Hardwick and like, you're not going to do any better. So it's a guy named Sir William Saintlow. He was serving in Elizabeth's household, which is likely where Bess met him because she would have been hanging out there. And next thing you know, these two got married. So each of Bess's husbands, and this is husband number 3, was more politically powerful and wealthy than the previous one, and William Saintlow was truly a catch for her. He was Elizabeth I's captain of the guard and chief butler of England, which was apparently a very prestigious thing to be, although it makes me think of the butler from Downton Abbey, and well, that was very prestigious. Anyway, he's not a butler like that. Butler clearly meant a different thing then. Anyway, so like WC, William Saintlow owned lots of prestigious estates and land and property, so Bess was able to continue her new real passion, which was building homes, renovating homes, but not flipping them, like not selling them to other people, but just having them for herself, like adding to her real estate portfolio. And then of course, when they owned property and land, the people who lived on that land would pay them rent because they were also landlords. So we see from William Saintlow's letters to Bess, he was also truly smitten with her. He adored her. He wrote things like, my own, more dearer to me than I am to myself. And she wrote back to him being like, please negotiate a better price for the window fixtures. And he loved her for that. Like, I love that she finds these guys who get who she is and she doesn't have to compromise who she is. Like, she's just being herself and they're cool with it. The vibe is really like, she's Bess and he's just Ken with these marriages. So normally in this context, where the husband was, the wife would go be with him also. But William Saintlow got that Bess needed to be at Chatsworth overseeing the renovations of his house in Derbyshire. In one letter, he even referred to Bess as my honest, sweet Chatsworth, like he called her the name of the house, because he knew how much it meant. So it's like, Bess, how much you love this house. I love you that much, you as a person. In a moment that I found, again, it's like, what was inside her heart? It's interesting. So one of Bess's letters was signed Elizabeth Cavendish, which was her previous surname with WC. Then she crossed off Cavendish and wrote Saintlow. Haha, just kidding. That's my new last name. Like, she was too busy wheeling and dealing for like renovation materials, getting a good deal on limestone or whatever to remember what her surname even was. Or she just was remembering how much she liked WC. And she was hands-on with all of it. Like, she was choosing the craftsmen. She was figuring out the design. Like, she was really invested in this and involved in this. But also, some scandal was around the corner. So William Saintlow had a brother called Edward. And Edward wanted to inherit all of the St. Lo estates and money. And so William St. Lo had been married before, and he had children from a previous marriage, but they were all daughters. So Edward, his brother, was like, okay, like he knew that he would be the heir when William St. Lo died. So he saw Bess as a threat because she was 32, young enough that she might have a son. And if there was a new baby, St. Lo, Edward wouldn't inherit anything. And so he decided to murder her. Edward, I just want to say, was, as we say on the show, a wrong-on. He had experience with poisoning people to get what he wanted. For instance, he'd married a woman named Bridget Scott, described as a very lusty young woman. So I like her already. She was pregnant when they got married, but the timing of it was like, so Bridget Scott had been married to a 90-year-old husband who died from being poisoned. Bridget Scott was pregnant and then married Edward St. Lo. And then after they got married, within 2 months, Bridget also died, probably also being poisoned. And Edward married another woman who he had had dealings with who was related to the 90-year-old man. Anyway, so Edward is just like a practiced poisoner, but no one could ever get enough proof of what he was doing. But he just like, okay, like when he's like, I'm going to kill Bess of Hardwick, it's like he knows what he's doing. And what happened was Edward and his new wife came to visit Bess and William St. Lo, and shortly after they left, she fell very sick with the symptoms of being poisoned. Everyone immediately assumed Edward had poisoned her because that's just his deal. William St. Lo believed it was true. Their mother thought it was true, but Bess's condition improved because, you know, even poison was like, oh, fuck, it's Bess of Hardwick. I poison. I'm going to not kill you because you have so much more to do. She didn't die. There was an investigation. The investigation found that Edward had been working with a necromancer, but he was not sent to jail because Bess hadn't died. And also people fell sick for lots of reasons back then. They couldn't prove it was poison, so everyone just agreed to move on, apparently, except for Edward, who was still determined to cut Bess out of the will to make himself the only heir. So Edward brought William St. Lo to court, and the verdict was that Edward's wife, Margaret, could inherit one of the manors as long as she lived. So I guess maybe they were just subtly trying to make Edward not kill his latest wife. So what happened is that William St. Lo had his will rewritten so that Bess would inherit everything from him, leaving nothing for Edward. So whether or not Bess had a new baby, Edward was cut off entirely. Fuck you, Edward. Like, you get what you deserve. During this time period, Bess of Hardwick was on good terms with the Queen. She kind of always was, but at this point, she received a royal gift for New Year's. And the royal gift was that Elizabeth agreed to waive all of the debt that Bess still owed on behalf of WC. So between just being good and charming and not manipulative, but in a good way, like she gets what she wants. Like Bess, there clearly was something about Bess of Hardwick where people just liked her. And that's very powerful. So debt's paid off. She's married to a new rich husband. She wasn't poisoned. And she's going to inherit everything from William St. Lo whenever he dies. And she spent much of her time overseeing construction at Chatsworth House. I just picture her going over blueprints, being like, do we like this? Grout? I don't know. While William St. Lo just was at royal court being the butler and whatever. So 1560 is when Bess's friend, godmother of one of her children, Lady Catherine Grey, who we did an episode about also in the Jane Grey season, there's a lot of overlap here, had a super secret sexy marriage to Ned Seymour and got pregnant. This was a real scandal because Catherine Grey was in the line of succession to maybe be the next monarch, but Ned Seymour kind of also was, or something like that. Anyway, Catherine Grey couldn't just marry whoever she wanted, was the situation, and she was pregnant. She confided in somebody who was called Elizabeth St. Lo. Now, you tell me, listeners, because I did an episode about Catherine Grey, and some sources mistakenly assume when it says she confided in someone called Elizabeth St. Lo, that means Bess of Hardwick, because remember, her name is Elizabeth. She's married to Mr. St. Lo, like her name is Elizabeth St. Lo. But the thing is, William St. Lo had a sister called Elizabeth St. Lo, and that's who Catherine Grey confided in. So I'm not sure what I said in that episode, but different sources say different things. But what we now know, and this is the thing, history grows and changes, and things I said in previous episodes might now have been proven to be not true. Anyway, so Elizabeth St. Lo, not Bess of Hardwick. Bess of Hardwick, not involved in this mess. So Elizabeth St. Lo, the sister of William St. Lo, was one of Queen Elizabeth's privy chamber women, and she wasn't any help at all when Catherine Grey confided in her. Apparently she fell into great weeping. And that's the sign that this is not Bess of Hardwick. Because first of all, I don't think Catherine would have told Bess of Hardwick, because Bess of Hardwick doesn't seem like a friendly ear to cry on. But also Bess of Hardwick, I don't think is someone who would fall into weeping when confronted with some sort of tragedy. Anyway, Catherine Grey was sent to prison. Her husband was sent to prison. They got to share a room. She got pregnant again. Eventually, Catherine Grey died. I did a whole episode about that if you want to hear that. It's in the Jane Grey season. Elizabeth St. Lo, the sister, was dismissed from the Privy Chamber and spent 6 months in the Tower. Bess of Hardwick, meanwhile, just building houses, doing fine. But then, 1564, she's called back to London because her husband had become very ill. He died before she even got there. And she was fairly certain he'd been poisoned by his horrible brother, Edward. I assume the same. But the thing is, whether Edward poisoned him or not, Edward didn't know about the will change and that he was cut out of the inheritance altogether. But remember, William St. Lo had daughters, so they also, because everything went to Bess. So his daughters were unhappy that they didn't inherit anything. So how it worked was the property went to Edward's wife and the money went to Bess. So this whole thing made Bess kind of look a little bit like a gold digger / black widow. Edward took her to court to contest the terms of the will. I feel like the courtroom is just like, oh, Bess of Hardwick, please come this way. You have an express lane you hear so often. But nothing changed. Margaret St. Lo, the wife of Edward, still got the house. Bess still got the money. Edward got the nothing. Good riddance, honestly. So glad to have that all behind her, we can assume. Bess headed off to Derbyshire to oversee construction projects because she was a real estate / house building maven. She was rich, wealthy, and influential and could have chosen to live out the rest of her life as a widow just based on her widow's pension and the inheritance she got from William St. Lo, but that's not her style, man. She returned to royal court in 1566, and everyone was like, oh my God, it's Bess of Hardwick, the coolest person. Is she going to take a new husband, and who's she going to choose? And so she was so rich at this point, so different from the person with, no fortune and no prospects. Now it's just she could have whoever she wanted. I mean, she always could, but now she could because of money. And so she decided that she was going to marry, with royal permission, she went through Elizabeth, no secret sexy weddings here, George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and the son of one of her children's godfathers. We called him in the previous episode Mr. Bess, and I'm still going to call him that because, she's everything. He's just Ken. So, Mr. Bess was the richest man in England. The richest man. Not just one of them. He was the richest man in England. And marrying him meant that Bess now got the title of Countess of Shrewsbury. And so, being a countess put her up in a whole new league of just sort of fanciness. The wealth and status was also helpful for the interests of her children. She wanted her children to get good marriages. She's not just I, Bess, want to be rich and whatever. She's I want to look out for my family. I want to elevate them. And this is something I think I wanted to talk about in this episode. And we're getting into it, and so I will now. Just the concept of money trauma. So there's a course called The Trauma of Money, which I've not taken, but I've heard about, and I'm strongly considering. I heard about it first. There's two Canadian financial influencers I follow on Instagram. Bridget Casey is one, and she talks about this a lot. And so I was just looking up and the name of the other. Anyway, there's a podcast called Money Feels Podcast. They talk about this a lot. Bridget Casey, and then the other influencer is called Mixed Up Money. Anyway, it's the issue of if you grow up without a lot of money, then if you then become a person who has money, or that the trauma of growing up without money could turn you into a person who's really single-mindedly focused on money, and that can become problematic in some ways, psychologically. And you could also become a person who, even when you have money, you feel weird about it. You feel weird about spending it, or you can't stop amassing it, or you feel you have to always be working. And so I think part of that is what's playing out with Bess here. It was just interesting to be consuming their content while I was reading about Bess of Hardwick. I'm oh, she's got money trauma. She is so wealthy, but she wasn't to begin with. She knew after her father died, and we didn't talk about that a lot, but it does in the biography I read. It was really challenging for them, for her mother, for her and her siblings to survive. So the fact that she bought land in Derbyshire, and is building this house, and she just needs to keep sort of consuming and constructing. Is there something about she needs to build a home? I don't know. But also at the same point, I don't want to be and that's why she married this guy. It's she's an ambitious person. She couldn't just be I'm going to be a home builder at the end. It's the only way that she could elevate herself is by marrying a man again. So she finds the best man to marry, like the richest man in England. And anyway, this is how her ambition was able to manifest, because she wasn't able to like get a job, and she's not like other people we've talked about where it's like she's a queen or whatever. So her new husband, Mr. Bess, was close-ish to her age. He was like 6 or 7 years younger than her. And he was also best friends, interestingly, with William Cecil, who we've talked about a lot in the Mary Queen of Scots episodes. So it's nice to see a softer side of William Cecil, just being bros with this guy. Mr. Bess also has, even for like a person from this time and era, incredibly hard to read handwriting, which might be because he had rheumatism and arthritis in his hands. He wrote a lot of letters, and, you know, my empathy goes out to the archivists and the writers who need to try and understand what words he says, and also to his friends at the time, because apparently it's just like really indecipherable handwriting. So he owned lots of land all over the place, I think partially through the whole dissolution of the monasteries thing, including he owned some land in Derbyshire. He also owned lots of property, including Tutbury Castle, which you'll remember from the Mary Queen of Scots episodes as the Swamp House. So he was already the father of 7 children from his previous marriage, and as part of their marriage settlement, and it sounds like Bess probably worked out the marriage settlement herself because she's just apparently an amateur lawyer by now. One of the things that was part of this was that they married 4 of their children to each other. So Bess's daughter Mary was married to George's son Gilbert. Bess's son Henry, her bad son Henry, was married to George's daughter Grace. So this is a thing that just people did at that time. And it seems weird to us now. Everyone wasn't doing this then, but this was like not super weird then. It was just a way to really cement the entwining of the 2 households. There were caveats listed in this arrangement that any of these children died before the marriages were consummated. Like Bess's daughters were quite young, so the marriages weren't going to happen for several years. Their marriages would then be moved on to the next younger sibling in each family. Anyway, with this new title came new lands and money, and Bess was just like, you know what I'm going to do with these lands and money? Build goddamn houses. So in this extremely rich family building their houses, Mary Queen of Scots suddenly came by. So if you want to know her story, I've done like 20 hours of content on it. But just to briefly remind you what part of the story this is, Mary Queen of Scots is in England, and Elizabeth doesn't want her to take over the throne, so she's kind of in house arrest, but they have to find someone for her to live with. And it's really expensive for Mary Queen of Scots to be her house guest because she had like 16-course meals 3 times a day or whatever. And so they're like, who are we going to get to be sort of the jailer / babysitter of Mary Queen of Scots? And the person who they chose was Mr. Bess. And this is partially because he was very trustworthy, partially because he was so rich. And Elizabeth, the queen, looked at just the various properties owned by these 2. And they were like, you know, which seems like the best property to send Mary to, that it's going to be hardest for people to come and rescue her or for her to escape from, is Tutbury, the house built on a swamp. Of this house, and this is a quote I hadn't seen before, but it was in this biography of Bess, Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote about this house. It is so damp that you cannot put any piece of furniture in that part without its being, in 3 or 4 days, covered with mold. Privies had no drain, which meant a continual stench. So this is like a shitty house. Literally, Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't want to be there. Bess didn't want to be there. It was more just kind of like they owned it, but they didn't kind of want to live in it. But then one of the rules of being the babysitter of Mary, Queen of Scots, is that none of their children were allowed to be under the same roof as Mary. So this meant that Bess and Mr. Bess had to figure out which of their other houses all of their various children should live in, which I guess is helpfully 4 of the children are married to each other. So that's just 1 house instead of 2. And Mr. Bess was required to be in permanent attendance to Mary. So wherever she was, he had to be. And I mean, we've already seen Bess didn't feel the need to acquiesce to the societal convention that a wife should be where the husband is. But like, she didn't want to be in the swamp house. But, you know, this is a royal guest, so it's sort of a privilege to be her jailer. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Contained herein are the heresies of Redolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Redolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. So Lisa first. Bess was unseen. So Mary was 26 years old when she arrived. Bess was 42. Not a huge age gap, all things considered, but just something to keep in mind. It cost a lot of money to keep Mary there. They had to pay her personal servants. They had to pay every time they moved her from one house to another house. They had to transport all of her stuff. Food for her personal chefs to prepare her meals. So the costs were substantial. And even though they were rich, they didn't want to be spending money on this, right? So they're like, let's move out of the swamp house and into Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. So Mary spent a lot of time there in an apartment now known as the Queen of Scots room. And she and Bess both did embroidery. They're both really skilled at embroidery. Bess, if you listen to the episode I did where I interviewed Claire Hunter about her amazing book about Mary Queen of Scots and embroidery, she talks about her Bess of Hardwick. You can see her embroideries. A bunch of them are in various museums and homes in England. They're really good. Bess of Hardwick was really good at embroidery, perfect even stitches. Mary Queen of Scots had a lot. Her embroidery is more passionate. I think if I did an embroidery, it would be more like Mary Queen of Scots, where it's just you're really into it for a minute and then you daydream and then you get back into it. But Bess of Hardwick was really good at it. And so the two of them, we talk about this in the conversation with Claire Hunter, and in her book, she does as well. Sitting and stitching is a really social thing to do. You really get to know other people while you're doing this sort of task. And it's not just the two of them together. There's other servants. There's a person, Mary brought her personal embroiderer there. So there's a whole group of people just having a nice stitch and bitch session, really. So if you go to visit most museums in England, okay, there's a lot of museums in England. If you go to it's the National Gallery, the National Archives, the V&A, if you go to Hardwick Hall, which we haven't talked about yet, they did a lot of stitching. And you can tell who stitched what because Mary's have her initials on them and Bess's have her initials on them. Her initials at this time being ES because her name was Elizabeth Shrewsbury, technically. I didn't mention this before, but one of Bess's hobbies was sort of like Emma from the book Emma by Jane Austen. She just loved matchmaking other people, usually with the Queen's permission, but she really liked pairing people off. So we're going to get into the scheming grannies portion of this saga because we're skipping past 15 years because that is how much time Mary Queen of Scots was there. So this was getting kind of in the way of Bess's marriage to Mr. Bess, Mary's presence, but also the matchmaking is happening. So Bess had one unmarried child left. So while she's having to, like, Mr. Bess is with Mary, Bess is like building houses, but also matchmaking. And she wanted to matchmake for her youngest daughter, Elizabeth. So we're going to call, there's a lot of Elizabeths in this story. We're going to call the daughter Lizzie. So Bess had been trying to figure out the perfect husband for Lizzie. One option was Peregrine Bertie, the son of Catherine Willoughby, who we talked about in an episode years ago. Mr. Bess, like, she ran this plan past him and he was like, yeah, no, that sounds good. But those plans fell through, which led Bess to an even better plan, which was to marry Lizzie to Charles Lennox. Who is Charles Lennox? So Charles Lennox is the younger brother of Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' second husband, who was a disaster who got blown up and strangled. Charles's mother was Bess's friend Margaret Douglas, who we've also done an episode about, so Margaret Douglas was anxious to find a wife for Charles. What Margaret Douglas wanted. See, these are both not the mothers, the grandmothers. Or, no, I guess Margaret's the grandmother, Bess is the mother. But we're still going to call them scheming grannies because it's cute. So Margaret Douglas wanted to find a wife for Charles who had a really good dowry, because Margaret Douglas needed some money, and the person who had money was Bess of goddamn Hardwick. So Charles was kind of an heir to the throne of England. So if he had a child with Lizzie, that child could maybe be the next monarch, which would make Bess and Margaret grandmothers/great-grandmothers to the next king or queen. And so they're like, yes, how do we make this happen? Mr. Bess not consulted with this plan. And I love this plan. This is what happened. So Margaret, the grandmother, oh no, they're both mothers. Why do we call them grannies? Oh, because they're both grandmothers of the child who's born later. Still, I'm not going to change it. It's the scheming grannies. Margaret and her son Charles. They're like, we're just going to go on a trip to the north of England, super casual, no big deal. And then while they're in that part of the country, they happen to get an invitation from Bess of Hardwick being like, why don't you come visit me where I'm staying at Rufford Abbey, which is one of the dissolved abbeys that Mr. Bess had acquired to turn into a house. It's near where you are. And Bess happened to be staying there herself. So once Margaret and Charles arrived, Margaret fell ill, quote unquote, and needed to lie in bed for 5 days. During those 5 days, Charles and Lizzie fell in love and then got married right there at Rufford Abbey. And they didn't get permission or anything. It's just everyone was like, well, this wasn't a scheme. It's just a sick granny. 2 young people happen to fall in love and get immediately married. This is just a true love story. No schemes here. No. Mr. Bess, who had been cut out of this planning, was just like, this is clearly a scheme. Like, what the fuck did you do? Like, I'm an important person at royal court. Elizabeth is going to be so mad. So he had to like save face with Elizabeth, being like, I was super not involved in this. I didn't know anything about this. But Lizzie was pregnant and they couldn't annul the marriage or anything like this had happened. Margaret Douglas, Charles's mom, was sent to the Tower of London for her role in this, but Bess was not punished. So previously, and from another source I read, and this is the thing with history reading, it's like one source says this, one source says this. I do not know which is true. Both of them agree that Bess didn't really face any repercussions. One of them said Elizabeth summoned Bess and Bess just didn't go, and that was fine. This one just says Bess wasn't punished at all. But so maybe Mr. Bess's pleading paid off with Elizabeth, or maybe Elizabeth just liked Bess because Bess was cool. Whether or not Bess was sent for, the reason she was not punished is because she was the wife of Mr. Bess. Mr. Bess was the jailer of Mary Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth needed Bess with Mr. Bess, like for jailer purposes. So Lizzie had a baby, the 2 women became grannies, and the baby was a daughter whose name was Arbella Stewart, who I've also done an episode about, but don't worry, we're gonna recap her story coming right up. So Charles died of tuberculosis, a real theme this season. So Lizzie was now a widow. There's sort of a question of like, well, what's gonna happen? Who's gonna raise Arbella? Especially because 3 years later, Margaret died. And so there's a thing about, well, now is Arbella the heir to the Lennox family inheritance? Like, who is going to watch after Arbella? And the answer to this is basically Bess of Hardwick, because that's what she wanted to have happen. And so that's what happened. But that's not what usually happens, because there's a whole thing with like wards and like people can buy the wardship of people. But anyway, Bess was just like, fuck all this. Like, I'm going to be the guardian of Arbella. Or no, she is going to be eventually. First, Charles died. Lizzie is now a widow. The mother is still there. We don't have to worry about who is going to take care of Arbella. But when Margaret Lennox died, there's the thing about the inheritance. So Arbella should have legally gotten the Lennox family inheritance, but Elizabeth I was like, or what about not? So the title wound up with Esme Stuart, who we talked about in a previous episode. I don't have time to get into it. James, Mary Queen of Scots' son, took all the jewels that Arbella should have inherited. Bess is just like, this is some bullshit. And so she got her allies together to try and restore Arbella's inheritance. Who were the allies? Well, her husband's bestie, Cecil, Francis Walsingham, and Robert Dudley, Queen Elizabeth's boyfriend, aka Bobby Duds. Bess also appealed to Elizabeth directly. The ultimate result was that Lizzie, the daughter, was awarded custody of Arbella rather than the whole wardship being sold scenario. Both Arbella and Lizzie were provided with pensions from the Lennox family fortune. And so the other thing that Bess, she's just like, but I also want more things. So she kind of hoped that if Elizabeth saw Arbella, who at this point was like 3 years old and really cute, there's a portrait of her looking really cute, that Elizabeth, her heart would soften and maybe she'd give them some more stuff, but not really. Meanwhile, Bess had her own disaster son, Henry, who was a wrong-on. He didn't have any legitimate children with his wife, Grace, but he did have numerous illegitimate children with various women, such that he was known as, quote, the common bull of Derbyshire and Staffordshire. He's just like the rooster of the chickens who were women in that area. So anyway, he and his wife Grace had to live in the Tutbury Swamp Palace, so maybe that's part of why he was mad all the time. Life was not great. He was often in debt, and he appealed to his mother, Bess, to help out, but she did not. Bess and Mr. Bess, so they own all these houses and also property, and the people who live in the land of this property were their tenants, like they were landlords. And apparently, they were not cool landlords, to the point that the tenants teamed up to protest their leases being revoked and rents being raised and people being evicted. This kind of union of tenants went to court under the leadership of the amazingly named Otwell Higginbotham. So they went to court and Mr. Bess was like, no. The people who I evicted were lewd persons and they deserve to be evicted. But the court was like, you suck. We find in favor of the lewd persons. And so this was sort of stressful for Elizabeth, the Queen, because having unhappy tenants posed a security risk to Mary Queen of Scots, because constantly there were all these people who wanted to maybe like free Mary Queen of Scots from this house, and any sort of like tension was something that the Catholic supporters could maybe use to their advantage. Mr. Bess, honestly, like at this point, he's just over it. He's over all of it. Like he's been watching Mary Queen of Scots for whatever, like 15 years or something. He also, various things are happening to him mental health wise. So he became paranoid, convinced that his son Gilbert and Gilbert's wife / stepsister / Bess's daughter, Mary, were on cahoots with Bess against him. They kind of were, because he was not doing great. So their marriage just kind of fell apart to the point that everyone knew about it. All the servants were taking sides, and the presence of Mary Queen of Scots was just exacerbating existing tensions about money. Mr. Bess felt that Bess was asking him for too much money for her various building projects, which sucks because like she had her own money, but she also had to ask him for money because the whole thing with like women couldn't own money, or like she had her own money from the income from William St. Lowe. But like as a married couple, she should have access to their like joint money, but she had to go through Mr. Bess to do that. And he's like, no, we're spending so much money on Mary Queen of Scots and her like 32-course meals and whatever. But the tension in the marriage was also concerning to Elizabeth because, again, Mary Queen of Scots security threats, because, you know, maybe the tension in the marriage could be exploited by supporters of Mary Queen of Scots. At this point, every single servant in all of their houses, Bess and Mr. Bess's houses, was on the payroll of either the Catholics or of Walsingham or both. At this point, Bess was not seeing Mary Queen of Scots as much anymore. Like no longer are they having their little embroidery bitch sessions, because Mary had to be like, Mr. Bess had to be with Mary, and Bess was just like, I feel like avoiding Mr. Bess because he's like losing his goddamn mind. Christmas, 1581. Bess's daughter, Lizzie, Arbella's mom, died. So what had been sorted before was that Arbella got a bit of a pension and Lizzie got a bit of a pension. And so Bess was like, well, I feel like the amount of pension Lizzie had been getting should now go to Arbella. So she wrote to Walsingham and Cecil asking, can Arbella get that money now too? And Elizabeth said no. Mr. Bess, meanwhile, keeping busy on a building project of a house called Worksop. I don't know his age specifically at this point, but it feels like a midlife crisis house. He's building kind of to spite Bess because she had been building on Chatsworth for so long and he knew that she loved houses. So he's like, Even though I have a lot of houses and unpaid bills and is always whining about how he doesn't have enough money, he wanted to build a grand house that would be better than Chatsworth to outdo Bess. So this just kind of shows he's a piece of shit. They were warring, they were arguing, but they were still sometimes together. Until. And this is like, I'll explain to you this as I read it. It doesn't make entire sense to me. What does make sense is that Mr. Bess was having some real mental health type things. He might have had some strokes that might have affected his brain because the level of hatred that he was expressing for Bess, people around him were being like, dude, what are you doing? Like, Mr. Bess is just not doing well. So they were together at their house in Sheffield, and then Bess left that house. So later, Mr. Bess would claim that she left voluntarily, but Bess would say that she had been sent away. Mr. Bess had assured her he would send for her again soon, but he never sent for her again. And from the moment she left, Mr. Bess stopped paying her £1,000 annual allowance and claimed that she had sold some land without his agreement, so he would make up the money from rents from her lands, so her tenants should pay him rent. Those tenants refused to do that because that's some bullshit. Mr. Bess sent a bailiff to demand that they pay him and not Bess. He had effectively declared war on Bess of Hardwick, which, like, it's just not what you do. And he saw everyone around him as either team him or team Bess. He raged constantly against her to anyone who he ever saw, even though everyone was always encouraging him to reconcile with Bess, including Queen Elizabeth. But his behavior was erratic and illogical, and he refused. Bobby Duds, of all people, was called in to mediate. No success. I'm not surprised. That's not who I would call in to mediate. Anyway, so it was a marital civil war. This went on for years, and it was largely to do with property and money. And they were just going through like line items in their shared budget, being like, you owe me $2 from this. You owe me $3 from this. The main overarching thing is that Mr. Bess thought that Bess and her sons and his son were trying to take all his money, and Bess was saying that she wanted to hold on to what was rightfully hers and that he was trying to take that. He also had gout, which is a disease that is painful, and maybe that was exacerbating or making worse his whatever's going on with him mentally. But he was just like, he's not okay. The vibes I'm getting are like latter years Henry VIII vibes, who also had gout. But Bess remained still, calm, resolute. Like that picture of Selena Gomez in the blanket, Bess is just like, you know what? Like, I know I'm in the right, so let's just move on. So she decided to buy some more land, which she did. 1583, she bought the Hardwick estate. So Hardwick was the place where she had been born, and she wanted to build a house that she could enjoy independently of any husband, like, because she was effectively single. Like, they were super estranged. Simultaneously, she's also plotting marriage for Arbella. So, like, we're zipping through the years. If you're like, wasn't she just plotting marriage for Arbella? No, she's plotting marriage for Lizzie, but now Arbella, she wanted to figure this out. So one plan was to marry Arbella to Bobby Duds's 2-year-old son by his wife, Lettice Knowles, who he's also done an episode about. Like, if we drew a picture of this episode and how many crossovers, it's a big spider's web. Arbella has this claim to the throne, but Bobby Duds has all these political connections, and so this would be like a really powerful match. Therefore, Elizabeth, the queen, was not told about it, but Mary Queen of Scots heard about it, and she used her secret cipher letters to inform Elizabeth about it. Anyway, this 2-year-old son, he died as a young baby, and so this marriage did not happen. But Bess is still thinking about this. And then, like, Mr. Bess is just chaos. Like, he's just like, he hates her. He's got like this real incel energy. And then rumors of an affair between Mr. Bess and Mary Queen of Scots became widespread by 1584. Mary, Queen of Scots, was writing, she's just like, no, like, I would never. Mr. Bess was like, no, I would never. And they both were like, I'm pretty sure Bess of Hardwick and her sons had started these rumors. Which is like, I don't know if they started the rumors, but I don't think they shut down the rumors, because these rumors made Mr. Bess look bad, and they wanted to make Mr. Bess look bad. But Mary was like, she was firmly in team Mr. Bess at this point. So she claimed that Bess had offered to help her escape. She really threw her under the bus. She's like, Bess's son offered to be my spy. Bess's servants and Bess herself had delivered secret cipher letters to me. Bess may have helped start these rumors or help spread the rumors, but anyway, by the end of that summer, Mr. Bess was removed as Mary's custodian after 15 years. And like, the level of importance that these two people had to society is wild to me, because there was a commission was held examining their marriage, and the finding was a victory for Bess, Because the whole thing is that Mr. Bess was just like, fuck you, Bess, never come back here. I hate you. You're trying to take my money. And Bess is like, calm down. And Mr. Bess is like, don't tell me to calm down. And Elizabeth and everyone was like, you just need to take her back. And Bess was like, I would go back to him, but he won't let me. So the finding of this commission was that Mr. Bess had to reconcile with Bess. He had to also return the money he'd seized in rents from her tenants, and he had to drop all pending legal suits against Bess's sons and servants. He did not do those things. They did not reconcile, and he kept making suits against, like lawsuits against Bess's servants and sons. So they returned to court the following year. Both of them appealed to William Cecil as a friend. And you know, like when you have like two friends who were a couple and then they split, you have to choose sides. So Cecil's really in the middle. One letter that Bess wrote to William Cecil, she signed off at the end as, your lordship's poor friend, greatly oppressed. So even though she was so rich and so powerful, Mr. Bess was still more powerful. And so she wasn't able to get everything she wanted. A second commission was held to try and get them to reconcile. Mr. Bess was again ordered to end all conflict with Bess, but everyone knew that wouldn't work because he just was too stubborn or whatever. One observer wrote, it was more likely that the wars in the Low Countries would come to an end than these civil discords between him and her. Then, 1586, Mary Queen of Scots, executed. Mr. Bess attended the execution. What this means for Bess is that her granddaughter Arbella is now second in line to the throne, wildly, after Mary Queen of Scots' son, James, King of Scots. So Elizabeth, in my notes I call her Liz, but I'm trying to be formal in talking on this podcast. Elizabeth I made one final attempt to reconcile Bess and Mr. Bess. You know, God bless, but like that did not work. Mr. Bess had by now taken up with a mistress who was his housekeeper, Eleanor Britton. And Bess had found a new love as well, her building project, Hardwick Hall. So, these days, Hardwick Hall is open to visit. It's one of the most gorgeous buildings in England. But when we talk about Hardwick Hall now, that's actually Hardwick Hall 2.0. It's Hardwick New Hall. The first thing that Bess, the first project she did in this area is what's now called Old Hardwick Hall, which is next to it and currently mostly in ruins because it was sort of abandoned. So she built two houses next to each other. We're going to talk about this one first. Before any of those were there was Hardwick House, which is where Bess had grown up, and that had been originally built by her grandfather. But it was too small for her needs and her current tastes, so she wanted to build her new, like, I'm an independent woman home without any specific plan or any one overseer. So Old Hardwick Hall is kind of chaotic, but she'd spent like 30 years overseeing renovations at Chatsworth, so she knew like where to get good deals on materials and labor. She knew what she liked and didn't like in terms of like ceiling height or whatever. While this was happening, Arbella is now like 12 years old, and she was sent to royal court to meet Elizabeth and try to make a good enough impression that maybe she'd be named heir or get a really good marriage arranged for her. But Arbella disgraced herself by insisting on taking precedence over ladies of higher rank as they walked to chapel, and she was sent home. She was sent back to Derbyshire. By 1590, Bess had mostly completed building the old hall, but it was weird, incoherent, and oddly unbalanced, kind of like the Tudor mansion version of Weird Barbie's house in the Barbie movie. And then, in fairly quick order, Bobby Duds died. Walsingham also died, and these are two of Bess's allies. Her only ally she really had left from the old guard was Cecil. It was like all new younger people there now. Then Mr. Bess died, thank God, age 62. His mistress / housekeeper, Eleanor Britton, who I have to say, sounds pretty great, just in like a dirtbag sort of way. So she promptly set about removing money, jewels, furniture, and bedding from the home, along with he used to keep a bunch of silver and gold in his room just for like to have money on hand, like Scrooge McDuck. And Eleanor Britton allegedly took all of that as well. And this became a whole thing. So Mr. Bess's heir was his son, Gilbert, who's married to Bess's daughter, Mary. And there's a whole thing about like, so all this money was taken. No one could find Eleanor Britton. Like, again, good for her. Get your bag, whatever. But Mr. Bess had more than just these like gold and silver. He had like homes and properties and stuff. And there's a whole thing about who's going to be the executor of the estate. Gilbert, his son, just appointed himself sole executor. He discovered his father had died with debts. Gilbert had debts of his own. And so he declared war on Eleanor Britton as well as his own brothers and Bess because he just wanted money and he felt like he deserved it. I hate that he's called Gilbert because the name Gilbert to me, I think of Gilbert from Anne of Green Gables. And that's like The Gilbert from Angry Gables from the Megan Follows series is just like one of my original childhood crushes. And I hate that this guy's called Gilbert because it's just like, anyway, one of Gilbert's shenanigans was at one point he challenged his brother to a duel. The brother declined, and then Gilbert claimed that the brother had tried to murder him with poison gloves. Like, he's just like, he's a mess, and not in a fun way. So he used to be Bess's ally back when she was like helping loan him money and stuff. But now he was like Mr. Bess 2.0, like Mr. Bess Jr. He was her nemesis, her enemy. Part of why he was mad at her was because he had to provide her £3,000 annually as her widow's pension. But he was like, no, I need that money to pay off my debts. I'm a dirtbag, whatever. So she was still busy working at Hardwick Hall 2.0. So Hardwick Hall 1.0 wasn't even finished yet. And a few hundred yards away, she started Hardwick Hall 2.0 because she saw like old Hardwick Hall. She's like, this is great. My house is cool, but also it's crazy. Let's build a house that's more like symmetrical and looks nicer. So she wanted the new house. So the first one's kind of dress rehearsal. The second one was going to be architecturally coherent, and she hired Robert Smithson, who is apparently the first English architect. So this home was the first time in England that an architect was commissioned to design a building, apparently. And if you go there or if you look at pictures of it, Hardwick Hall, this is the building people now call Hardwick Hall. The way that it looks now, like each floor has a higher ceiling than the floor below it. There's these so many windows, huge windows everywhere. And this was an era where windows were a sign of wealth. Like houses couldn't afford windows in general. And this is just like all windows. There's a saying, Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, which is true if you see a picture of it. There's turrets at the top of it. And what I love about this is like her initials, ES, like Elizabeth Shrewsbury, are carved into the building itself, like out of stone. Like if you see a picture of Hardwick Hall, it's like this beautiful symmetrical house. And at the top, there's kind of like little sticking up bits. And if you zoom into those sticking up, it's her initials with a little crown on top. Like this bitch. I love it. I love it. She's just like, this is my house and I am the coolest person. And it's true when she was. So to furnish her two new homes, she moved over some of the finest furnishings from Chatsworth, but she needed more, especially tapestries, because she was, as a stylistic choice or maybe as like a cost saving, she was only doing wood paneling on like half of the walls, and the rest there would be large tapestry. So in 1591/1592, she went to London for an 8-month shopping spree. And while she was there, you know, because she was always multitasking, she also was kind of like hanging out at royal court, seeing who's who, how she could elevate Arbella's position maybe better. She also, because Gilbert was like taking her to court to like get money. And she's like, okay, if we go to court in London, I don't know if I'll win or not. But if we go to court in Derbyshire, where everybody loves me / are my tenants, I'll probably win. So she's like, how can I get the court case to be in Derbyshire, instead of London? And what she did is she like hired every lawyer in London. So Gilbert couldn't get a lawyer. So they had to do the court case somewhere else, which is similar to, if you listen on my Patreon to Vulgar Peace Theater, we did an episode on Tombstone, the movie, the Western, where there's a whole thing where Kevin Costner wanted to do another movie on the same topic. So the guy who was doing the costumes for Tombstone just rented every Wild West costume in all of America so that the Kevin Costner movie couldn't get any costumes. Like, this is the same vibe to me. Anyway, she's in town doing this like shopping spree, y'all. And so she got numerous tapestries and she got a lot of them on sale because she just knows her shit. She knows what to do. She knows how to get a good deal. She's like rich, but also is into bargaining. So she got a great deal from this estate sale. So there's a guy called Sir William Hatton who was selling off stuff to pay off his own debts. And so she got various tapestries and she got the price reduced on one of them because the tapestry had his arms, like his like signal or whatever on it. And she's like, I'm going to have to replace that with my own. So can you please take off £5 from the price? And he's like, okay. But then she got her own like logo put on, but just like instead of embroidered on, it was just sort of like ironed on or something. And it only cost like 30 cents. So she made money on that anyway. Among these tapestries is a hanging featuring historical and mythical female figures intended to show Bess's virtues. So the women are all defined by their relationship to their husbands as wives or widows. And I just want to briefly tell you who they are because it's a big vulgar history type vibe to just like get a huge, and these are like life size. It's like people in these tapestries are the size of a person now. But just having tapestries showing like great women of history is like, that's what I'm all about. So one of the people on them is Lucretia, who was the loyal wife of a Roman general she's shown holding a knife to her breast. And her story, I looked up to see what her story was. And it was basically she was assaulted and then she killed herself. Because of that, the Roman monarchy ended and the Roman Republic began. But she killed herself because she was married to somebody. She was assaulted by somebody else. And she's like, my husband is too important to me. I'm going to kill myself. There's also a tapestry. This is all one big tapestry, showing Zenobia, who was a queen who lived in the 3rd century in Palmyra, Syria. She was married to the king, and after he was assassinated, she ruled the kingdom as regent for her son and continued on his work. So her noble actions are that she carried on her husband's campaign and work after his death. One of the other people represented is Artemisia of Caria, not the one I did the episode about. This is Artemisia II of Caria. And her thing is that she and her husband created one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. When her husband died, she was so overwhelmed with grief, she put her husband's ashes into a goblet of wine and drank it so she could be her husband's living tomb. And then there's also Penelope, the wife of Odysseus in the Odyssey by Homer. And her whole thing was her husband went away and he was gone for so long that people thought he was probably dead. And so suitors came every day asking to marry her, but she wanted to stay loyal to him. So she's like, well, I can't accept anyone's hand until I finish my weaving. But every night she would undo her weaving, so her weaving never ended. Another person who's on the tapestry. So if you go there, you can see those ones. There was another one, but it's no longer there. I guess that part fell apart or whatever. But there's also Cleopatra. So it's interesting that the people there are just like really loyal, like wives who were powerful because of who their husbands were, but who were so loyal to their husbands. And like this is a thing Bess bought from somebody else. Bess didn't commission this. But it's interesting because she's married to this guy who she's like actively at war with. But maybe she's thinking more WC and how she's loyal to him. Anyway, this and many of these hangings are some of the largest and most splendid embroideries surviving from the Elizabethan age. Asterix, more on that at the end of the episode with breaking news. So Bess also started a new business venture. Like in her 70s, she decided to start doing money lending, which is really interesting. So in the absence of banks, cash was badly needed and in a short supply in Tudor England. So people needed literal money. And we talked about this last year in the Doña Gracia Nasi episode where we're talking about just historically the jobs that Jewish people have had in Western European countries. And a lot of times because money lending, I think in the Christian Bible says like you shouldn't do it. So like, quote, good Christians shouldn't do money lending, which is why it was a job that was available. And then that's why Jewish people got into it. So it's interesting to hear that Bess was just like, but that's the thing. Like she was never super religious, right? She was just like, this is a business I can do and make money at. Great. This is similar to how Mr. Bess had like the gold and the silver in his bedroom. She kept cash in her bedroom, but that was just like for the bank. Oh, Bess. Along with a pair of scales. She collected interest at 10%. So legally, that was the highest amount of interest you could charge. She frequently lent money on the security of land. She collected land and property as well, like mortgages. In one instance where a guy needed money, she got him to mortgage his property in Arbella's name. So eventually he died. And then the 5 manors became Arbella's. So Bess was just like amassing property because there's a bunch of people, including her son-in-law / stepson Gilbert, who just were in her bed son Henry. Like she just knew that these people were shitty with money and she could make money off of it. And she did. And again, I just feel like Bess, get your bag. In her 70s, she's like, you know what I'm going to do? Start a new career. So anyway, but also now that Mr. Bess was dead, she had freedom as a widow. She did not get married again. But because she had watched her various husbands and how they ran their household and how they ran their businesses, like she had various skills from Mr. Bess, she learned how not to manage your affairs. And so she's just like running her various households, building things. So Hardwick Hall 2.0 is coming along amazingly. So about the windows, so glass had been manufactured in England since the 13th century, but it was like not as good as the glass manufactured in France until this one guy in the 16th century came over. Like he brought over skilled glassmakers from Lorraine and Normandy. So it was easier to get fancier glass by the time she was doing Hardwick Hall, but Bess was like, not good enough for me, bitches. She set up her own glassworks operation to like make her own glass. Like this is how rich she is. And this is also how specific she is with her vision and what she wanted the house to look like. So 1597, Hardwick Hall 2.0. Mostly but not entirely done, but she, unlike Penelope on her tapestry, was not patient and she was just wanted to move in. So that year, October 4th, 1597, she had some of her more musically inclined members of her household play a triumphant march, and she walked into the house and she was just like, yeah, this is my house. Those are my initials. fuck you, Mr. Bess, this is what's happening. And we don't know what she did for a few years. Like she was just vibing out, I guess, just like having a nice time, but also just like still commissioning projects. She started building alms houses, so like poor houses, like places for like houseless people to go, which is interesting and good of her. I'm not criticizing that at all. This coincides with her getting older and maybe wanting to like do more good works in the world, because as much religion as she may or may not have, she probably was just like, let's just do some good deeds in case heaven and hell are like a real thing, so I can go to the direction I want to go. She also was preparing for her death. So she's in like her early 80s, I think. She commissioned Smithson, the same guy who designed Hardwick Hall, to design her tomb, which she wanted to be of black stone and marble. And she also drew up her will, which she would amend several times based on the events I'm about to tell you about. So, 1602, all hell breaks loose with her and Arbella. Arbella is by now 27 years old, has not been married. She's had to share a room with Bess this whole time. Like if you go to visit Hardwick Hall, there's like 2 beds in the room. Like one of them is Arbella's. Like she's just like, get me out of here. I did a whole episode about Arbella. But basically, Arbella figured out the only way she could escape the clutches of her grandmother was by marriage. And the marriage that she wanted to have was to 16-year-old descendant of Catherine Grey's prison baby. And the thing with this is that Arbella really idolized Catherine Grey and her sort of romantic story of like super secret sexy marriage. But then the thing, Arbella has this claim to the throne, and then Catherine Grey's son has this claim to the throne. So the two of them married. Like Elizabeth would never, and it would be like a super dangerous combination of people. I do love, like, Arbella was a chaotic person. Her plans were not good, but one part of her plan that was good was she had, part of it was like, I need to trick Bess to leave the house. What will I do? She'll get her boyfriend to pretend to be a guy with some land and property to sell, because she's like, I know Bess would go do that, because there's one thing she knows about Bess is that she likes to buy property. Anyway, the plan was discovered. Bess freaked out. Arbella was put under sort of armed guard. And then it was like war of 2 people in a house 2.0. Servants again took sides. Some were on Arbella's side, some were on Bess's side. I truly don't know between those two why you would take Arbella's side, but whatever. Anyway, Arbella wrote letters to some of her aunts and uncles to see if they would help. Everyone said no, including Gilbert, but one person said, okay, I'll help you. And that's Uncle Henry, Bess's bad son, off in the swamp house. He's just like, I'll do anything. So he helped arrange for Arbella to escape, but she was caught. You can hear all of this in the Arbella Stewart episode. At this point, Bess changed her will to remove Arbella and Henry. Then Queen Elizabeth died, and the new king was named, and it's Mary Queen of Scots' son, James. So the whole thing about, like, is Arbella going to be the new queen is like, probably not, but she's pretty chaotic anyway. So then bad son Henry was implicated in, here's the thing, there's so many plots in the Mary Queen of Scots episodes, but people didn't stop plotting just because she died. So there's a plot called the Bye plot, which was a thing where Catholics were working together with Puritans, power duo, on a plan to kidnap James and force him to allow freedom of religion. Good luck with that. Did not happen or work, obviously. So Henry was implicated in that. But then there was another plot he was not involved in that happened at the same time, which was sort of like, what if the Bye plot is step 1? So this is called the main plot. And this plot was to kidnap and murder James and his sons, and then have Arbella placed as queen. They were making this plan, and then somebody told Arbella, hey, just FYI, we're doing this plan. They sent her a letter, and she sent the letter to James being like, FYI, this is happening. So, like, she was not on board this plan. Even Arbella, chaos person, was not involved in this plan. So bad son Henry was brought to court as a co-conspirator because he had been involved in the Bye plot, but not in the main plot. He was found not guilty. Arbella, meanwhile, she did manage to escape Bess's house. She was allowed to come live at royal court, but she got there and she's just like, oh, this is fucked up. I don't like this. Because the king is James. Like, it's just like people having fun and partying all the time. And that's not Arbella's vibe either. Although she was named godmother of James's daughter, Princess Mary. So interestingly, Mary Queen of Scots was staying with Bess and Mr. Bess for 15 years. And now we are now 15 more years later after the death of Mr. Bess. And Bess and Gilbert are still feuding. They've been feuding for 15 years. Then, at the same 15-year point, the gunpowder plot happened, which I'm not going to explain to you right now, but this is briefly. It's the Guy Fawkes thing. So where Catholics wanted to blow up the Parliament building with James and his older son inside, and then place James's young daughter Elizabeth on the throne as their puppet monarch, but they were discovered. I'm mentioning this not just because Bess was like living for the drama of it all. She loved hearing all the details. But because she wasn't living in London, like she was living in Hardwick, but she wanted to know what's going on. The connection here is that Gilbert was implicated by association with the gunpowder plot because his wife, Mary, Bess's daughter, was a Catholic, and she was friends with some of the, like, friend of a friend with some of the gunpowder people, but neither of them were arrested for this, though. So by now, Bess, she's now in her like mid to late 80s and just doing poorly. She had arthritis that affected her ability to walk without assistance. She's just in a lot of pain. And soon enough, she I don't know, just the symptoms became too much. They were sort of like various things were happening. And she's just like, okay, clearly I'm dying. So let's figure this out. Like she still had her wits about her. Like she was still able to think very clearly. So she redid her will, I think, one last time. And then she did die. So on February 13th, age 87, her body was transported to the tomb she had commissioned, where she was to be buried with the Cavendish family, WC's family, not with the Mr. Bess family, because it's like that was the family of her heart, the Cavendishes. What's happened since then is that subsequent generations of the Mr. Bess family, whose last name is Talbot, they didn't thrive as well as the Cavendishes did, the WC family, because the Cavendish family, their fortune is built on the estates and properties Bess had accumulated and or built. From that line, the Cavendishes, the Dukes of Devonshire, come from that line, one of whom married Georgiana Cavendish, who is a person I'll talk about in another podcast in the future, I'm sure. And that all leads to Princess Diana in some way. Anyway, here's the thing. Like when we're talking about people on the show and are thinking about what is their legacy, and it's like, what did their descendants do or whatever? Like her descendants did amazing because she set them up to succeed. And that's, what is it? Generational wealth. You know, she overcame her money trauma to provide generational wealth to her descendants. And that was part of what she like enjoyed spending money and having nice things, but she also wanted to set up her family for success so they wouldn't live and struggle like she did as a younger person. And she did. She succeeded because she's Bess. But equally important, potentially more important, is the homes that she built. Like she was involved in home building for 50 years. Most of the homes, like many of the other homes built at the same time, fell into disrepair, but her descendants, especially in Hardwick Hall, like they maintained it. So Hardwick Hall 2.0 is now overseen by the National Trust. It is architecturally unchanged and its interiors are still much the same as when she lived there. And then, so the Duke of Devonshire, like that dukedom, those are her descendants. So under the 9th Duke of Devonshire, which is like the early 20th century, he really cared about the house. Extensive repairs were done to the structure and stonework, and after he died in 1938, his widow, Evelyn, devoted herself to the repair and restoration of Bess's tapestries and hangings, which are still there as well. Which brings us to late-breaking news, August 2023. So, headline from The Guardian. A unique set of 16th century tapestries have gone on display after a 24-year, £1.7 million restoration project. So the 13 tapestries, which portray the Old Testament story of Gideon, were bought for Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire in 1592 by its owner, Bess of Hardwick, during her shopping spree era. So centuries of damage and dirt have been tackled by a team of experts working on one 6-meter wall hanging at a time. So like this took 24 years to restore this thing, and it just was put in like this month. So each tapestry was taken to the National Trust's conservation studio in Norfolk. Process began with sending each tapestry to Belgium for specialist cleaning. Once back at the studio, the team completed painstaking work to repair tears and replace stitches where possible, all by hand. Like they were, to get the thread and stuff, they're using natural dyes to match it perfectly and stuff, like so it would be just like how it was at the time. The National Trust Senior National Curator Emma Slocum said, quote, "These astonishing tapestries have been in the Long Gallery since it was first decorated at the end of the 16th century. Extraordinarily, that's where they remain." End quote. So in total, the conservation, stitching, lining, and reconstruction took 5,470 hours to complete, or 24 years. Denise Edwards, former Hardwick Estate General Manager, oversaw the project for 20 years, retiring shortly before it was completed. So that's one thing. Like I was working on this, and then I saw a bit ago, I follow the National Trust on Instagram, and they were like, "Oh, we have big news coming to Hardwick Hall," and it showed people carrying some long rolled up thing, and I'm just like, "What's happening?" And then they revealed this is what it was. These tapestries were just restored and are hanging there now. And then also, this same month, August 2023, it was announced by the National Trust and English Heritage that a new partnership agreement will see Hardwick Old Hall, Hardwick Hall 1.0, fully open to visitors for the first time in 5 years after extensive conservation work. So it's still like not a house with walls and a roof, but there's still a lot of the work is still there, like the carvings and things have all been restored. So that was just announced. So things are happening. Good work, National Trust. So in terms of Bess of Hardwick, she has not been in many, there's not been movies made about her. Like, it's a cool story to talk about. I would love to see a TV show or a movie about her, but I get that, you know, watching the story of a woman thriving and building houses and going to court repeatedly is not as exciting as maybe some other historical things might be. She was in the 2018 Saoirse Ronan Mary Queen of Scots movie. She's played there by Gemma Chan, which is interesting. Firstly, because the movie was doing sort of colorblind casting and whatever, but also because Gemma Chan has recently-ish said that she's working on an Anna May Wong biopic, where she'll be playing Anna May Wong. So that connects last week's episode with this week's episode. Hepburn's back. She's got thoughts. And we need to do some scoring. So Bess of Hardwick. The first thing is scandaliciousness. So this is how scandalous was she at the time. And the thing is, like, Elizabeth always forgave her, which doesn't necessarily mean she wasn't scandalous. The most scandalous thing she did was scheming grannies, like getting the two of those people married without Elizabeth's permission. But that's not really scandalous. Like, she went to court all the time, but that wasn't, like, the dissolution of her marriage was maybe seen as scandalous. I don't know. I'm going to give her 5. And that's mainly just for scheming grannies, because the audacity, you know, I'm giving her not any more points to respect the fact that she found ways to thrive without being scandalous. Scheminess is a straight up 10, because that's just not just scheming grannies vibes, but also arranging all the marriages, like all the court stuff, the thing where she hired every lawyer in London, just the building plans, like the schemes to build houses, to hire an architect, like she thought things out. Like, what a manager. You know, I would read a book. Well, I wouldn't read this book, but someone could write this book that's like leadership lessons from Bess of Hardwick. I don't personally have an interest in learning leadership lessons because I don't want to be a leader, but I think that would be good business advice for people. The next is significance. And this is like her descendants would say she's very significant. Hardwick Hall itself is like a very famous, notable building, and she made it. And it's, you know, it's routinely in the list of, you know, like top buildings in England, just like the design of it, the importance of it, being the first building that had an architect, like all the houses she built. Like, I feel like financially she was significant. I don't see her as like breaking down barriers for like women home builders or whatever, but being the person who built Hardwick Hall, very significant. Like, her in her lifetime was very significant. I'm going to say like a 7 for significance, almost entirely because of Hardwick Hall. And then I've been thinking about this honestly, because sexism is the last thing. It's like, how much did sexism get in her way? And I'm going to say, like, it tried to. The patriarchy tried to stop her, but she kind of like Elizabeth I, where it's kind of like she figured like, okay, this is how I can play this game. I'm going to play this game. Like, she wasn't, like, the way that she could achieve her ambitions was to marry a series of increasingly wealthy husbands, and she did. Like, she built these houses. Like, sexism did not super get in her way. Like, she had all these children, but she, you know, she survived childbirth and everything. Out of her long life, that was just 8 years, was having babies. I don't know, like, if she had been a man, maybe there wouldn't have been some of the inheritance issues, but like, she still got all the inheritances. I don't know. Man, I'm gonna say 4. I'm gonna say 4 for sexism, just because, not because it wasn't there, but just because she was able to work around it and it didn't get in her way. And that's what that's for. So that's 17. So that is a 27 is her score. You can see all of the scores. If you go to the website at vulgarhistory.com, there's like a thing to click on that says scores. But I will say 27 is a very standard score. Nothing wrong with that. That's just like a person who scores high in some things and not high in some other things tends to get a 27. So, like, for instance, Lady Jane Grey has a 29.5. Catherine Grey has a 29. And that's because both of them had real scandal. Who else is around here who she knew? Lettice Knowles, Bobby Dudd's wife, 28. Cleopatra, 28. Margaret Douglas, the other scheming granny, has a 28. Arbella Stewart, 28. And then we get to the 27s. Frances Grey is a 27. Catherine Parr is a 27. Like, she fits right in with the people who were of her time and era and whatever. So what I did want to tell you as well, just in our little wrap up here, is that next week I've got a really exciting author interview that I think you're going to enjoy. We're talking about linguistics, which, even if you're like, oh, I'm not interested in linguistics, it's like, what about the history of feminist words? Anyway, and then the week after that, it's going to be the end of the Mary Queen of Scots episodes with a look at the 4 Marys. And then the show is going to continue on after that. You know, in past years when I finish a season, I've taken a hiatus, but I've figured out ways to keep episodes coming every week. So Don't worry, the show's not going anywhere. And if you want to keep up with this show, so we are on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, also on Threads at Vulgar History Pod. Honestly, there's this weird diaspora of social media happening right now. I'm also on Blue Sky, but like, is anyone on Blue Sky? I don't really know. I made like a Facebook page. Like truly, I'm just like taking Vulgar History and putting on various social media and just kind of seeing, just sort of wherever you are, you know, you can tag me. I'm also on TikTok at Vulgar History. The main place where I'm posting shit is Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. If you want to get in touch with me, you can use the forum at vulgarhistory.com, or you can email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. We also have merch available at vulgarhistory.com/store. That takes you to the TeePublic store. If you're living outside the US, the shipping is better if you use the Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. We also have a Patreon. So if you support this podcast with a monthly donation at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, you get various cool things. So if you pledge at least $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes, including past episodes. If you pledge at least $5 a month, $5 or more a month, you get to hear bonus episodes. So that's So This Asshole episodes where I talk about gross men from history. Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas, like movie recap podcasts. And then also at that tier, the $5 a month or more tiers, you get access to a new thing, which is also where I've been chatting with people, which is we have a Discord server, the Vulgar History Salon. So you need to join the Patreon at the $5 a month or more level to get access to the Discord server and chatting, but it's been interesting. I really like it's just a low-key place to just kind of like Tits Out Brigade can like talk to each other and also to me. Recently, because as I'm recording this, the Elizabeth of Valois episode is what's just come out. And so we had a really nice and interesting conversation about, you know, childbirth and the dangers of it back before doctors knew they had to wash their hands. They couldn't just like touch a dead body and then like put your hand up inside a woman and deliver a baby, because if you did that, you would give her horrible infections. And that's why so many women died in childbirth. So the fact that Bess of Hardwick had, like, she delivered 8 children and did not die is remarkable. And thank goodness, because look at how much she did in her 87 years of life. Anyway, thank you all for listening to this podcast. There will be more episodes, more Mary Queen of Scots stuff in 2 weeks, and a super special bonus episode next week. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.